Imagine a place where the guards gave up, where the men behind bars became the law, where your only chance of surviving the night depends on which gang you swear loyalty to before the sun goes down. This is not a film. This is not a story someone made up. This is El Salvador's most feared prison, and for thousands of men, this was every single day. Inside these walls, the government lost control. The gangs took over. And one man, Carlos Mejia, walked through those gates on a Tuesday afternoon with nothing but a thin mattress, a number on his wrist, and no idea that the next 3 years would test every limit of human survival. By the time he walked out, if he walked out, he would be a completely different person. What happened inside those walls will shock you. Stay with us because this story gets darker before it gets any light. If you've never heard of what happened inside El Salvador's prisons, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. This story isn't like anything we've covered before. Let's go. The moment Carlos stepped off the transport bus, the noise hit him like a wall, shouting, metal clanging, a constant, low rumble of hundreds of men packed into a space built for a fraction of that number. Guards processed him quickly, name, number, photograph, and within 20 minutes, he was standing at the entrance to cell block D. Nobody told him the rules. Nobody gave him a map. A veteran inmate named Lobo appeared beside him without warning, looked him up and down, and said 3 words, walk straight, eyes forward. Carlos did not know it yet, but Lobo had just saved his life. Because the first 10 seconds you walk into a cell block determines how every man in that block will treat you for the rest of your sentence. Show fear, and you become a target. Walk with your chin up, and you might earn yourself a day. Cell block D was designed to hold 40 inmates. On the day Carlos arrived, it held over 200. Men slept in shifts. If you were new, you slept on the floor near the toilet. That was not negotiable. The smell was something Carlos later described as impossible to put into words: sweat, sewage, cigarette smoke, and something else entirely that he never found a name for. Personal space did not exist. Every inch of every wall was marked, and not with paint, but with a language. Gang symbols, death tallies, names of the fallen, warnings for rivals. The entire cell was a living document of violence and power. Carlos had 48 hours to figure out who was in charge here. Not the guards, they had already lost that distinction long before he arrived. The men who controlled this block controlled everything: food, safety, sleep, and whether you woke up the next morning. El Salvador's prisons were not one world, they were two, divided by an invisible line that everyone could see. On one side, MS-13, the Mara Salvatrucha, one of the most violent criminal organizations on earth. On the other side, Barrio 18, their sworn enemies, equally ruthless, equally organized. These 2 factions had been at war for decades. Inside prison, that war did not pause, it intensified. Every new inmate was eventually claimed by one side or the other. There was no middle ground, no neutral zone. If you came from a neighborhood controlled by MS-13 on the outside, you walked to the left side. If you were from Barrio 18 territory, you went right, crossed the invisible line, and you would not live to explain why. Carlos came from a neighborhood where both gangs operated. He had no automatic allegiance, and that made him more dangerous to both sides than any declared enemy. It happened on his second night. Carlos was sitting on his floor mattress, keeping his head down, when 3 men from the MS-13 side walked over. They did not speak. The leader, a man with a teardrop tattoo beneath his left eye, simply stood over Carlos and waited. This was the test. Every new rival faced it. What the leader wanted was submission, eye contact broken, head bowed, space surrendered. What Carlos did instead surprised everyone in that block. He met the man's eyes and held them for 3 full seconds without blinking. Then he nodded once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if to say, I see you, and I am not afraid. The leader stared for another moment, then walked away. Lobo, watching from across the cell, exhaled for the first time in 2 minutes. He told Carlos later that night that he had either just earned himself enormous respect or marked himself for death. They would find out which within the week. Lobo had been inside for 11 years. He had outlived 4 cellmates, survived 2 gang wars inside these walls, and learned every unwritten rule this prison ran on. He was not affiliated with either major gang, the status that should have made him a target, but his longevity and reputation had earned him a rare neutrality that both sides quietly respected. He took Carlos under his guidance for one reason. Carlos reminded him of himself at 24. Smart enough to survive, but naive enough to make a fatal mistake in his first month. Lobo began teaching Carlos the language of this place. Which guards could be bribed and which ones reported everything back to gang leadership. Which inmates were informants. Where the blind spots in the surveillance cameras were. Which hours of the day violence was most likely to erupt. This was not a prison education you found in any book. It was the difference between alive and dead. Money meant nothing inside. What mattered was what you had that someone else wanted. Cigarettes were the universal currency, even non-smokers hoarded them. Phone credits were gold. Extra food from the kitchen could buy you protection for a week. Information was the most valuable commodity of all. The gangs controlled all of it. They ran the internal market, set the prices, and taxed every transaction that happened within their territory. If you wanted to make a phone call, you paid. If you wanted an extra blanket, you paid. If you wanted to sleep without watching your back, you paid with loyalty, labor, or silence. Carlos had arrived with nothing. Within his first week, Lobo taught him how to make himself useful as small tasks, careful favors, building credit in a system that had no bank and no receipts. One wrong move in this economy did not cost you money. It cost you limbs. Or worse. The guards had long since given up any pretense of control. Outnumbered, under-resourced, and frequently threatened, most of them had reached a quiet understanding with gang leadership. You will not come in there, and you will not come after us. They stood at perimeter posts, processed paperwork, and looked the other way when sounds of violence drifted from the interior of the blocks. Some guards were bribed. Some were genuinely afraid. A very few still tried to maintain some semblance of order, but they operated in a system that had been broken long before they arrived. Carlos watched a guard witness an inmate being beaten in the corridor and respond by walking in the opposite direction. He understood then that no help was coming from the outside. The only law that mattered here was the one written by the men in ink on their arms and necks. And if you wanted protection, you had to find it within that law. It started over a debt to cigarettes. That was how Lobo explained it afterward, though the real cause ran decades deeper, rooted in street wars that had followed both sides through the gates. A Barrio 18 member named Tigger had borrowed from an MS-13 runner and delayed repayment by 1 day. In any other world, that was nothing. Inside cell block D, that was a declaration. Carlos was in the yard when it started. He heard the signals, 3 sharp whistles, and his body moved before his mind caught up. Lobo had drilled him. When you hear that, you go to the wall, you put your back against it, and you do not move. Carlos hit the wall and watched as 20 men collapsed into each other in the center of the yard. Improvised blades flashed in the light. Men went down. The violence lasted for minutes before the leaders on both sides called it off, not out of mercy, but because they had made their point. 3 men were carried away. 1 never came back. After the yard cleared, a silence fell over cell block D that Carlos would describe years later as the loudest thing he ever heard. Every man sat with their thoughts and their fear pressed behind their eyes, saying nothing. There was no processing what had just happened. No grief, at least not openly. Grief was a luxury this place did not allow. By dinner that evening, the cell was functioning as if nothing had occurred. Men ate, traded, argued about small things. But Carlos noticed the ways moved differently now, more quickly, checking corners, exits, the positions of the opposing side's members. The violence had reset something, established new temperature. Both gangs had reminded everyone, new rivals especially, what the cost of misstep looked like. Carlos sat with his food and touched for a long time that night. Lobo watched him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. This was the place. This was survival. And they were both still in it. 3 weeks into his sentence, MS-13's block leader, a man who went by El Maestro, pulled Carlos aside during the brief afternoon movement period. El Maestro was not what most people imagined when they thought of a gang leader. He was calm, educated. He had been running this block for 6 years and had done it through intelligence rather than constant violence. He knew that Carlos was unaffiliated. He also knew that Carlos was smart, steady under pressure, and had survived his initiation test with an unusual kind of composure. El Maestro did not threaten. He offered a place at the table, protection, better sleeping arrangements, access to the block's resources in exchange for one thing, Carlos's skills as a writer and reader. Rare inside these walls, put to use keeping the gang's internal communications clear and coded. It was not a request Carlos could take lightly. Saying yes meant choosing a side. Saying no meant refusing El Maestro to his face. He had 48 hours to decide. Carlos had not come from a gang family. His mother had worked 3 jobs. His younger sister was still in school. He had ended up in this prison not through a life of crime, but through one moment, a confrontation that went wrong, a man who fell, a sentence that the judge handed down in under 3 minutes. He had never wanted any part of this world, but the world had placed him inside it with no exit sign. He lay awake that night running the mathematics of his situation. Refusing El Maestro would make him an enemy of the most powerful faction in the block. Accepting would make him an enemy of Barrio 18, either way. He was choosing a war. Lobo, who had heard about the approach through sources Carlos did not ask about, gave him advice: before lights out, never join the side that asks you. Because the side that has to recruit is the side that needs something from you more than you need them. That changes the power. Carlos turned that sentence over in his mind until dawn. Carlos had made his decision, but carrying it out was going to require something he had never had to rely on before: the ability to play 2 sides of a wall simultaneously, without either side knowing. He was not going to join MS-13. He was not going to align with Barrio 18. He was going to give El Maestro an answer that was technically a yes and practically a no, and he was going to need every bit of intelligence Lobo had poured into him over the past 3 weeks to survive what came next. The decision was made in the dark, before 5 a.m., when the cell was still and the only sound was the breathing of 30 men who had all made their own impossible choices to keep living in this place. Carlos sat up, put his back against the wall, and waited for the morning. Because inside these walls, every morning was a negotiation with fate. If this story is gripping you right now, hit that like button and subscribe. There are over 200 men inside this prison, and only one way this story ends. You need to be here for it. Carlos went to El Maestro and gave him this. He would handle communications. He would read, write, and translate, but only materials that did not require him to take any position in the gang's operations. He framed it as a practical offer. A man who belongs to no one is useful to everyone. A man who belongs to MS-13 becomes invisible to anyone outside it. El Maestro studied him for a moment that stretched long enough to make 2 of the men flanking him shift their weight. Then he nodded once. The deal was not formal. There were no handshakes in this world. Agreements were held by reputation and enforced by consequence. Carlos walked away from that corridor with a role in the block's structure, but without a tattoo, without an oath, and without the chain that came with full membership. Lobo, watching from across the yard, allowed himself a small smile. The kid had learned fast. What Carlos discovered once he was inside the operation was that MS-13's control of this block was not random violence, it was a structured system. There were roles, responsibilities, a chain of command that rivaled anything in the legitimate world. Men managed territory, supplies, conflict resolution, and external communications with associates on the outside. The gang had phones smuggled in through a network Carlos was never fully shown. They had contacts in the court system, and local government offices, and in neighborhoods across the country. The violence that the outside world saw was the surface, the enforcement mechanism of a much deeper structure. Carlos's job was to help document internal agreements, write coded messages that looked like personal letters, and occasionally translate between Spanish and English for communications that reached across borders. He was, in the language of the outside world, a secretary. In the language of this prison, he was now indispensable. Word traveled fast. Within 10 days of his arrangement with El Maestro, Barrio 18 knew. A folded piece of paper reached Carlos during morning movement, passed through 3 hands without a word spoken. He unfolded it in a bathroom stall. It read, in simple Spanish, "You chose the wrong side. Change it or we will change it for you." Carlos destroyed the paper and told no one except Lobo. Lobo was quiet for a long time. Then he said that Barrio 18 sending a message instead of acting immediately meant one thing. They also wanted what Carlos offered. They were not going to move on him yet because they were still calculating whether he could be turned. Carlos had approximately 2 weeks before that calculation resolved. What he needed to do in those 2 weeks was make himself so embedded, so necessary to the overall balance of the block, that removing him would destabilize things that neither side wanted destabilized. It was an impossible strategy. He started building it the next morning. The prison had a library, 3 shelves of donated books, mostly water damaged, in a room that was officially open 2 hours a week and practically ignored by the entire population. Carlos began spending every available minute there. At first, the other inmates dismissed it. A man who read books in prison was either deeply educated or deeply strange, and neither status was particularly safe. But Carlos was not there for literature. He was building something. He started reading legal texts, old court procedure manuals, criminal code books, anything related to sentencing and appeals. And then he started doing something no one had done in this block before. He started helping inmates understand their own cases. A man named Flacco had been inside for 7 years on a charge he could barely articulate. Carlos read his documents, found 3 procedural errors, and wrote a formal letter to his public defender. It was the first letter Flacco had ever sent. It was the beginning of something that would change Carlos's position in this prison completely. Word spread the way all important things spread inside prison, through whispers at the meal line, through notes passed between cells, through the look on Flacco's face when he came back from a legal consultation and said his lawyer had actually responded. Within 3 weeks, Carlos had a line outside the library that included men from both sides of the block's divide. And something extraordinary happened in that small room. The invisible line ceased to exist. An MS-13 member and a Barrio 18 member would sit 2 chairs apart, waiting their turn, and not a word of conflict passed between them. They were there for something they wanted more than they wanted to fight. They were there for a chance, however small, to get out. Carlos understood the power this gave him. It was not the power of violence or threat. It was the power of being irreplaceable. Neither side would move against the man who was the only person in this building reading their legal documents and writing their letters home. In the 4th month, Lobo received news from outside. Carlos was not there when it arrived, but he saw the aftermath. He found Lobo sitting at the back of the cell, entirely still, in a way that was different from his usual quiet. The older man had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Carlos sat beside him without speaking. Eventually, Lobo said his son, who had been 8 years old when Lobo was sentenced, had been recruited. He was 17 now, and had just been arrested for the first time. The thing Lobo had spent 11 years inside trying to prevent by staying silent, by refusing to communicate, refusing to let his son know the details of this life, had happened anyway. The street had found the boy without any help from his father. Lobo did not speak again that evening. And Carlos understood, sitting there in the dark of that prison cell, that survival was not just about your own body. Sometimes the thing that breaks you is not in the room with you at all. 6 months into Carlos's sentence, the government announced a crackdown. New security protocols. Military units brought in to assist. International pressure following a report that described El Salvador's prisons as effectively gang-run, which they were, but seeing it written in a foreign newspaper apparently changed things. The crackdown hit cell block D like a storm. Soldiers conducted searches that turned up phones, weapons, stockpiled goods. 3 of El Maestro's senior men were transferred to solitary. The internal economy collapsed overnight. The things that had created stability, the agreements, the supply chains, the understood order were stripped away in a series of raids that lasted 2 weeks. And what followed the order was not freedom. It was chaos. Because the fragile peace that gangs maintained through their control of resources evaporated when the resources vanished. In the absence of the gang economy, old debts surfaced. Old vendettas, suppressed by the logic of business, came back without the filter. Carlos and Lobo spent the crackdown weeks barely leaving their corner of the cell. The riot started on a Thursday. Nobody planned it, or rather, everyone planned a smaller version of it, and those small plans collided into something no one fully controlled. A Barrio 18 member settled a 7-month-old debt with a metal shiv fashioned from a broken bed frame. 1,000s to 13 responded within minutes. What had been a localized conflict in one corner of the block became a full war zone in under 4 minutes. Carlos and Lobo went to the floor literally, face down, a strategy Lobo had explained in their very first week. In a riot, vertical targets die. Horizontal ones are harder to hit, easier to ignore. They stayed down while the block tore itself apart above them. The riot lasted 22 minutes before military units came in with gas. 17 men were hospitalized. 2 did not survive their injuries. When the smoke cleared and Carlos lifted his head from the floor, the cell block looked like a different place entirely. But the men were still there. And whatever came next, they would have to build something again from the wreckage. The morning after the riot was the quietest Carlos had experienced in his entire sentence. Men moved slowly, carefully, the way people move in the aftermath of something they are still processing. Remarkably, both sides began cleaning up without being told, not together, but in parallel, each managing their own territory. Carlos watched El Maestro and the senior Barrio 18 leader conduct a conversation in the center of the cell block, the first time he had ever seen them speak directly. It lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, something had been agreed. He did not find out what for 3 days, but the effect was immediate, a reduction in tension so sharp it was physically palpable. What he eventually learned was that both sides had calculated the same thing independently. The riot had cost them both. Resources gone, men injured, attention from authorities maximized. The logic of chaos had led them back, reluctantly, to the logic of order. And Carlos, a steady, neutral, known to both sides, was asked to be present at the next conversation as a witness. 8 months in, Carlos wrote to his mother for the first time since his arrest. He had avoided it deliberately, and willing to put into words what his life had become, and willing to make her picture the inside of this building. But Lobo's situation had changed something in him. He had watched a man who stayed silent to protect his family, and lost them anyway through that same silence. Carlos wrote 3 pages. He did not describe the violence or the fear. He described Lobo, without names. He described the library. He described the men waiting in line for their letters, and how some of them had never received a single piece of mail in years of incarceration. His mother wrote back in 12 days with single page, but every word was a lifeline. She told him his sister had finished school, that they were okay, that they waited. Carlos kept that letter folded inside the cover of a legal manual and read it so many times the paper began to separate at the creases. 10 months in, the arrangement that had held finally broke. A dispute over a document, a letter Carlos had written that one side claimed had been altered to benefit the other, brought both El Maestro and the Barrio 18 leadership to the library at the same time. Carlos was inside. He could hear them in the corridor before they entered. 12 men, both sides, and every one of them with eyes on him when they came through the door. El Maestro placed the letter on the table and asked Carlos to read it aloud. Carlos did. Then Barrio 18's leader placed his version, a handwritten copy, and asked him to compare them. Carlos looked at both documents for 60 seconds. Then he stated, clearly, in front of all 12 men, which version was accurate, and why. It happened to go against El Maestro. The room went silent. El Maestro stared at him long enough that every man in the library stopped breathing. Then he took the document, folded it, and walked out. That evening, Lobo told Carlos he had either just secured his neutrality permanently, or signed his own warrant. They would know by morning. Carlos Mejia served his full sentence, 3 years 2 months, and 11 days. When the gate opened on his release morning, he stood at the threshold for almost a full minute before stepping through. Lobo was still inside. They had said goodbye the night before with very few words, the way men say goodbye when the reason for the parting is not a destination but a locked door. On the outside, the city was the same. The noise was the same. But Carlos was not. He had entered that prison as a man who made one mistake on one night. He came out having witnessed the full architecture of a world that most people never see and few could survive. He went back to his family. He enrolled in legal aid training. And he eventually returned to that prison, not as an inmate, but as a volunteer, reading documents and writing letters for the men still inside who had no one else to do it for them. The library had 3 more shelves now. He made sure of it. If Carlos's story moved you, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Every week we bring you stories like this one. The men inside these walls deserve to be remembered. Don't miss the next one.